Long before non-stick pans and bottled cooking oils filled kitchen shelves, bacon grease was liquid gold in our grandparents' homes. Nothing was thrown away, not even the fat left behind after frying a few precious strips of bacon. That grease was carefully poured into a tin, a jar, or an old coffee can, then set beside the stove to be reused again and again. When food was scarce and paychecks were thin, bacon grease and bread could mean the difference between hunger and survival. A slice of die-old bread, warmed in a skillet and brushed with hot bacon drippings, suddenly became filling, flavorful, and comforting. For many families during the Great Depression and wartime years, this wasn't a side dish, it was the meal. The smell alone told a story. That smoky, salty aroma drifting through a small kitchen signaled warmth and nourishment, even when there wasn't much else to go around. Parents knew that a little grease could stretch a meal, add calories, and keep growing children full until morning. In rural homes especially, bacon grease flavored everything: fried potatoes, cornbread, beans, even simple greens pulled from the garden. But when cupboards were bare, bread and grease stood on their own, eaten quietly at the table, often without complaint. It was humble food, born from necessity, not nostalgia. Today, nutrition labels might warn against it, but back then, bacon grease was survival in a jar. It represented thrift, resilience, and the hard-earned wisdom of a generation that learned how to make something out of almost nothing. When you're ready, just say the next number and we'll keep walking back through history, one simple meal at a time. In kitchens where every scrap mattered, even water was never wasted. After a pot of potatoes had been boiled for supper, our grandparents didn't pour that cloudy water down the sink. Instead, they saved it because that murky liquid held starch, flavor, and just enough nourishment to become another meal. This was known quietly as potato water soup, and it was born out of pure necessity. A pinch of salt, maybe a bit of pepper, and if luck allowed, a spoonful of bacon grease or a chopped onion would be stirred in. The result wasn't fancy, and it wasn't filling for long, but it warmed the body and kept hunger at bay. During the Great Depression and wartime rationing, potatoes were cheap, dependable, and widely available. Families learned quickly that the water left behind carried calories, and pouring it out felt like throwing food away. Mothers especially understood that a thin soup could stretch a meal, feeding more mouths when there wasn't enough to go around. Served hot in chipped bowls, this soup often came with a piece of bread or a biscuit on the side. Children dipped slowly, savoring the warmth rather than the taste. It was the kind of meal eaten quietly, not because it was unpleasant, but because everyone understood why it existed. On long, hard days when meat was scarce and cupboards looked bare, cornbread and milk was a meal that asked for almost nothing, but gave back just enough to get through the night. It was especially common in rural homes where cornmeal was cheap, plentiful, and often ground locally. The cornbread was usually left over from the day before, already dry and crumbly. Instead of throwing it out, it was broken into pieces and placed in a bowl, then covered with cold milk or buttermilk. Sometimes a pinch of salt was added. If the family was lucky, a sprinkle of sugar turned it into a small comfort. This wasn't a dish meant to impress. It was meant to quiet hunger, especially for children, when supper had already stretched as far as it could. After a day of farm work or factory shifts, this simple bowl provided calories, calcium, and familiarity, things that mattered more than flavor. For many grandparents, cornbread and milk carry strong memories. It was eaten at kitchen tables late at night or served quickly before bed, often in silence. No one complained because everyone understood the unspoken rule: you ate what was available. Today it might sound like a strange combination. But in its time, cornbread and milk was comfort born from hardship. Reminder that survival didn't always require a full plate, just something warm, filling, and dependable. When meat was scarce or too expensive, our grandparents didn't let that stop them from enjoying gravy, a meal's most comforting companion. They learned to make pan gravy from flour, water, and leftover fat instead of meat drippings, creating a simple, filling sauce to pour over bread, potatoes, or vegetables. The process was humble but effective. Fat or bacon grease was heated in a pan. Flour was stirred in to make a roux, and water or milk was added slowly until it thickened. Seasoning, salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of herbs made a plain mixture taste warm, savory, and surprisingly satisfying. Gravy without meat was practical, economical, and adaptable. It could stretch small portions of food into a meal, helping families survive lean weeks when protein was scarce. Children often loved it, poured over bread, turning a simple slice into a hearty bite. This dish exemplifies the resourcefulness and ingenuity of a generation that learned to make do with what was available. It may seem plain today, but back then, gravy without meat was more than a sauce. It was survival, comfort, and the ability to turn scarcity into sustenance. Ever wonder how a simple sandwich can tell a story of survival? Let's talk about the fried bologna sandwich. During tough economic times, like the Great Depression and the years after, real cuts of meat were a luxury most families just couldn't afford. But there was always bologna, cheap, salty, and easy to find. It became the working family's go-to substitute, and frying it was the secret that turned it into something special. Imagine a slice of bologna hitting a hot skillet. It sizzles, curls up at the edges, and fills the kitchen with a smell that feels so much richer than the ingredient itself. Fried until it was just a little crispy, it would be slipped between two slices of bread. Sometimes plain, sometimes with a smear of mustard if you were lucky. For kids growing up in those days, this wasn't just a sandwich, it was a treat. The heat transformed something cold and bland into a warm, satisfying meal. It didn't matter that it was cheap. It tasted like effort. It tasted like love. It meant someone was making the best of what little they had. These sandwiches weren't just for lunch. They were often supper, served with potatoes or beans to stretch a small food budget across the whole family. Today, we might look back on it with a bit of humor and nostalgia. Back then, the fried bologna sandwich wasn't a trend. It was survival, one sizzling pan at a time. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ever wonder how a simple dish like beans on toast became a legend in so many kitchens? Let us take a look back at a time when this humble meal was more than just a quick snack, it was a lifeline. When money was tight and cupboards were looking a little bare, beans on toast was the quiet hero. It was cheap, it was filling, and it was always reliable. Especially during those long, hard winters when fresh food was a luxury. Think about it. A bag of dried beans, soaked overnight and simmered for hours, could stretch to feed an entire family for days. Piled high on a thick slice of toasted bread, the warm beans would soak right in, making every bite hearty and satisfying. The toast gave it substance, and the beans provided that much-needed protein and warmth. It was a simple formula, but it just worked. In many homes, this dish made an appearance more than once a week. It wasn't fancy, but it was dependable. A pinch of salt, maybe a little leftover gravy or bacon grease if you were lucky, and supper was served. For kids, it meant going to bed with a full stomach. For parents, it was a quiet sigh of relief, knowing they'd made it through another day. The practicality was key. No special kitchen gadgets needed, no expensive meat, and it used very little fuel, all crucial details when every penny was counted. It was a meal eaten quickly, often around a crowded table, with no food ever going to waste. Today we might joke about it, or look back with nostalgia, but during those tough times, beans on toast was a true symbol of survival. It proved that you don't need fancy ingredients to get by, just the ingenuity to make the most of what you have. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this little slice of history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Did you know that before butter was a staple in every kitchen, there was another fat that ruled the roost? It was lard, rendered from pork and saved with care. Lard was the heart of baking in many rural and working-class homes, especially when it came to making a simple, humble batch of biscuits. These weren't your fancy, fluffy buttermilk biscuits. Lard biscuits were made from the bare essentials: flour, lard, salt, and a splash of water, or maybe milk if you were lucky. The dough was mixed by hand, rolled out on well-worn countertops, and baked until just golden. They were dense, they were filling, and most importantly, they were incredibly comforting. Often, these biscuits had to stand in for meat on the dinner table. You could split one open and eat it plain, dip it in a thin gravy, or drizzle it with a bit of molasses. They were true meal stretchers, capable of quieting a hungry stomach when little else was available. A single biscuit could make all the difference, especially for children. In many homes, a cook's reputation rested on the quality of her biscuits. Even during the toughest of times, there was immense pride in making them light, flaky, and warm. The smell alone could fill a kitchen with a sense of abundance, even when cupboards were nearly bare. Today, we might think of lard biscuits as old-fashioned. But for our grandparents' generation, they were a form of survival food. They were born from thrift, skill, and the deep understanding that sometimes the bread itself has to be the entire meal. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the past. When there was almost nothing left in the house, onions were often the last thing standing. Cheap, long-lasting, and easy to grow, they became the foundation of one of the most desperate but memorable meals our grandparents knew: the onion sandwich. At its simplest, it was just raw onion slices between two pieces of bread, sprinkled with salt. Sometimes the onions were lightly fried in a pan to soften their bite and bring out a little sweetness. If the family was lucky, a smear of lard or a drip of bacon grease was added for richness. This wasn't a meal anyone looked forward to, but it was one that filled the stomach. Onions provided flavor when everything else tasted like nothing. Bread provided bulk. Together, they made something that could be eaten quickly and quietly, often without comment. For children, onion sandwiches were unforgettable, for better or worse. The sharp taste lingered, but so did the memory of how hard things were at the time. Adults understood the meaning behind the meal. It was what you ate when payday was still days away. Today, it sounds almost unthinkable. But in its time, the onion sandwich was proof of resilience. A reminder that survival sometimes came down to making a meal from whatever hadn't yet run out. Long before boxed mixes in modern kitchens, hoe cakes, also known as Johnny cakes, were survival food for the working poor. Made from little more than cornmeal, water, and salt, they were born out of necessity and cooked wherever heat was available. The name itself tells a story. These simple cakes were often cooked on the flat metal of a hoe held over an open fire or on a cast iron skillet placed directly on coals. In rural homes and farm camps, this was food that required no oven, no yeast, and no luxury ingredients. Hoe cakes were dense, slightly gritty and filling. They were eaten plain, torn apart by hand, or dipped into whatever liquid was available: milk, bean broth, or thin gravy. Sometimes a bit of fat was mixed in if lard or bacon grease could be spared. For generations, hoe cakes fed families through crop failures, hard winters, and long stretches without money. They showed up at breakfast, dinner, and supper, often multiple days in a row. No one complained, because hoe cakes meant there was still food. Today, they're sometimes romanticized as heritage cooking. But for our grandparents, hoe cakes weren't tradition, they were survival. Reminder that cornmeal and ingenuity could keep hunger away just a little longer. In a time when fresh ingredients were scarce and money was tighter still, milk toast was the ultimate comfort food. Simple, gentle, and inexpensive. It was often given to children, the elderly, or anyone feeling under the weather. A meal as much about nourishment as it was about care. The dish was exactly what it sounds like: slices of bread, toasted or even stale, softened in warm milk. A pinch of salt or a sprinkle of sugar might be added for flavor, and if the family was lucky, a pat of butter or a drizzle of bacon grease would turn it into a small treat. Milk toast was never meant to impress. It was filling enough to quiet hunger and warm the body, which mattered more than taste in households stretched thin. It could be eaten at the kitchen table, at a bedside, or even carried in a small bowl to someone who needed it most. For many grandparents, milk toast carries memories of quiet evenings and humble kitchens. It wasn't extravagant, but it represented care, thrift, and the ability to make something nourishing out of almost nothing. Today it may seem quaint, or even bland, but back then, milk toast was sustenance and comfort rolled into one. A gentle reminder of how even the simplest foods could carry both nourishment and love. When mealtime called for stretching leftovers into something hearty, potato and onion hash was a go-to solution in many households. Cheap, simple, and endlessly flexible, it turned humble ingredients into a filling meal that could feed a family for days. The process was straightforward: dialed potatoes, chopped or grated, fried in a pan with onions, sometimes with a bit of saved bacon grease or leftover fat if available. The potatoes absorbed the flavors of the onions and fat, crisping at the edges while staying soft inside. A sprinkle of salt and pepper was often enough to bring it all together. This dish wasn't just practical, it was comforting in its own quiet way. Families would gather around the kitchen table, savoring the warm, savory aroma that promised full stomachs even when cupboards were sparse. For children, it was filling. For parents, it was a way to make a small amount of food go farther. Potato and onion hash could be eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and often appeared on tables multiple times in a week. It was a masterclass in thrift, showing that with a little creativity, even simple scraps could become satisfying. Today, it's a nostalgic reminder of resourcefulness, a dish born of necessity that taught generations how to survive and sometimes even thrive in the bare minimum. When meat was scarce and every scrap mattered, scrapple and cornmeal mush became a way to transform leftovers and simple grains into a meal. These dishes were born out of necessity, turning inexpensive or leftover ingredients into something filling and sustaining. Scrapple, common in Pennsylvania Dutch and rural kitchens, was made from pork scraps, cornmeal, and seasonings. The mixture was formed into a loaf, sliced, and fried in a pan until crispy on the outside. Each slice delivered protein, flavor, and calories, a humble luxury in hard times. Similarly, cornmeal mush was made by boiling cornmeal in water or milk into a thick porridge. Once cooled, it could be sliced and fried the next day for breakfast or supper. It was cheap, flexible, and surprisingly satisfying, especially when drizzled with a bit of syrup, molasses, or leftover fat. Both scrapple and cornmeal mush represented ingenuity in the kitchen, showing that nothing was wasted. Families relied on them during the Depression, wartime rationing, or any period when meat and fresh ingredients were limited. Today, they're often remembered with a mix of nostalgia and curiosity. But for our grandparents, scrapple and cornmeal mush weren't gourmet. They were survival, transforming scarcity into a meal that could stretch through the day and fill hungry bellies. Rice has long been a humble, inexpensive staple, and for our grandparents, it was a versatile lifeline in the kitchen. With just a pot of rice, they could create a meal that was filling, cheap, and adaptable, depending on what was available. When eaten with sugar, rice became a simple, sweet dish, perfect for children or for a quick, inexpensive supper. Sometimes a bit of milk was added if it was on hand, turning plain rice into a warm, creamy comfort food that quieted hunger without requiring meat or elaborate ingredients. When paired with gravy, usually made from pan drippings or a small piece of meat, rice transformed into a savory meal. The rice absorbed every bit of flavor, stretching a few scraps into something substantial enough to feed a whole family. Even a small portion of gravy could make a simple bowl of rice feel like a feast. Rice was affordable, filling, and easy to prepare in bulk, a true survival food. It could be served hot for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And leftovers often appeared again the next day, sometimes fried with a bit of leftover fat. Today, rice is everywhere, but in our grandparents' kitchens. It was much more than a side dish. It was a blank canvas for ingenuity, simple grain that helped families make it through lean times with warmth and sustenance. When fresh meat was too expensive or scarce, salt pork became a pantry hero, and paired with beans, it could feed a family for days. Salt pork, heavily salted pork belly, or fatback, was cheap, preserved easily, and packed with flavor, making it a cornerstone of frugal cooking. The dish was simple: beans soaked overnight and simmered slowly with small pieces of salt pork, sometimes with onions, garlic, or herbs if they were available. The pork released its fat and seasoning into the beans, turning a humble pot of legumes into a rich, hearty meal that stretched far beyond the initial ingredients. Salt pork and beans were practical and economical. One small piece of pork could flavor a large pot of beans, feeding a family for multiple meals. Served with a slice of bread or cornbread, it became a complete, satisfying dish. This meal was especially common during the Depression and wartime rationing, when families had to make a little go a long way. It wasn't fancy, but it provided warmth, calories, and nourishment, everything a household needed when times were tough. Today, salt pork and beans might seem unusual, but in the past, it was a symbol of thrift, resourcefulness, and the quiet ingenuity of households determined to survive on what they had. Boring for long, our grandparents knew how to turn yesterday's breakfast into today's crispy delight. Thick cornmeal porridge, once cooled, could be sliced and fried in a hot pan with a bit of fat, lard, or bacon grease, creating a meal that was cheap, filling, and surprisingly satisfying. The slices were fried until golden and crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, offering texture and flavor that plain mush never had. Sometimes sugar or molasses was added for sweetness, or a pinch of salt for a savory bite. A little leftover gravy or beans could even accompany it, stretching the dish further. Fried cornmeal mush was practical and economical, making the most out of limited ingredients and reducing waste. It could appear at breakfast, lunch, or supper, and each batch could feed a family with very little cost. For many, it became a comfort food, with a memory attached to the smell of sizzling mush on a cold morning, the crunch of the golden edges, and the warmth of a simple meal made from scraps. In summer months or during times of scarcity, tomatoes from the garden or local markets often became the star of a simple meal. Fresh, juicy, and inexpensive. They were sliced and layered between bread to create the humble, yet surprisingly satisfying tomato sandwich. A sprinkle of salt and pepper was usually all that was needed to bring out the flavor. If families were lucky, a little mayonnaise or a smear of butter might be added, but often, it was just bread and tomato, eaten quickly to fill hungry stomachs. The natural juiciness of the tomato softened the bread, turning plain slices into a comforting bite. Tomato sandwiches were more than just sustenance. They were a way to make something fresh and flavorful out of what was available, especially in households where meat or dairy were luxuries. Children loved them for their simplicity, and adults appreciated the ease and low cost. For grandparents, these sandwiches represented resourcefulness, seasonal living, and the ability to enjoy small pleasures even in tough times. They were eaten at kitchen tables, on porches, or in fields during work breaks, a reminder that even minimal ingredients could bring satisfaction. Have you ever heard of chicken foot soup? It might sound a bit strange, but this humble dish has a really fascinating history. Let's take a trip back in time to an era when meat was a luxury, and nothing, absolutely nothing, went to waste. Our grandparents were masters of resourcefulness, and they knew a secret: chicken feet, often discarded, were a treasure trove of nutrition and flavor. The process was simple yet brilliant. They'd take cleaned chicken feet and simmer them for hours with just water, maybe an onion, and a few root vegetables, if they were lucky. This slow cooking method was key. They patiently coaxed out all the gelatin and rich flavor, transforming simple ingredients into a deeply nourishing broth. A pinch of salt or some leftover herbs would be added, turning what seemed like scraps into a surprisingly satisfying meal. Chicken foot soup was more than just food. It was a symbol of survival and ingenuity. During tough winters or wartime shortages, when fresh meat was a rare treat, this soup provided essential warmth and calories. Families would serve it with a slice of bread to make it last, ensuring everyone had something hot in their belly. So, every spoonful of this soup told a story. It wasn't just about taste. It was a lesson in thrift, patience, and the incredible ability to create something wonderful from what little you had. For many, the memory of chicken foot soup is bittersweet, a powerful reminder of resilience, and the clever ways our ancestors made the most of everything. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more fascinating food histories. See you next time. When cupboards were nearly empty and money was tight, bread and sugar became a simple yet effective way to quiet hunger. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't filling for long, but it was cheap, accessible, and sweet enough to bring comfort to children and adults alike. A slice of dialed bread, sometimes toasted, sometimes soft, was sprinkled generously with sugar. A little butter or fat might be added if available, but often it was eaten plain. The sweetness made it feel like a treat, even though it was born from necessity rather than indulgence. This humble meal was common during the Great Depression and other lean periods, especially for children who needed a quick snack or supper. Parents knew that a few simple ingredients could go a long way, and bread and sugar became a quiet symbol of survival. For kids, it was a small delight. For parents, it was a practical solution. A meal that was cheap, fast, and filled empty stomachs just enough. Today, it might seem almost too simple to be considered a meal. But back then, bread and sugar was ingenuity on a plate, turning scarcity into something sweet and sustaining. In times of scarcity, foraging wasn't just a hobby, it was survival. Dandelion greens, which grew wild in yards, fields, and along roadsides, became a free and surprisingly nutritious addition to many meals. The greens were usually boiled or sautéed with a little saved fat, sometimes seasoned with salt or onions if available. Bitter on their own, they absorbed flavors well, and their vitamins and minerals made them a valuable source of nutrition when fresh vegetables were otherwise scarce. Families often served them alongside potatoes, cornbread, or beans, stretching the meal further. For children, the taste could be strong, but parents understood the importance of making every scrap of greenery count. Garden vegetables weren't always available, and canned produce was expensive. So dandelion greens filled a crucial gap in the diet. These wild greens represent the ingenuity and adaptability of a generation that didn't waste, that ate seasonally, and that found sustenance in the simplest parts of the earth. For our grandparents, dandelion greens weren't just weeds. They were a symbol of resilience and the ability to survive on what nature provided. When ingredients were scarce and ovens were a luxury, hot water cornbread became a quick, inexpensive, and filling solution. Made from just cornmeal, salt, and boiling water. It was the kind of meal that could feed a family without requiring butter, milk, or eggs. The cornmeal was mixed with boiling water to form a thick batter, then dropped by spoonfuls onto a hot skillet or griddle. The result was a golden, crisp-edged bread with a soft center. Eaten plain, with a bit of sugar, or alongside beans, greens, or gravy. Even a small batch could stretch to feed several mouths. Hot water cornbread was especially common in rural homes and during hard times because it required minimal equipment and ingredients, yet provided warmth, sustenance, and comfort. Families often served it for breakfast, lunch, or supper, sometimes doubling the batch to carry leftovers into the next meal. Though simple, it taught thrift and resourcefulness, how to turn basic staples into something nourishing. Today, it's remembered fondly by those who grew up with it as a taste of survival and ingenuity in the kitchen, where a little cornmeal and water could go a long way. When nothing could be wasted, even potato peels became a meal. Our grandparents knew that scraps held both flavor and sustenance, and turning them into potato pancakes was a clever way to stretch every ingredient. The peels were washed, grated, and mixed with a little flour, salt, and sometimes an egg, if available. The mixture was then fried in a skillet with a bit of saved fat or bacon grease until crispy and golden. What might seem like trash today became a crispy, savory treat that could fill stomachs and curb hunger. Potato pancakes made from peels were practical, inexpensive, and often served alongside other humble staples like beans or cornbread. Families learned to cook them quickly over a hot stove, turning leftover scraps into a meal that children and adults alike could enjoy. Beyond being just food, these pancakes were a lesson in ingenuity and thrift, showing that nothing, no matter how small or overlooked, was wasted. In many households, they became a favorite, remembered fondly even decades later for the resourcefulness they represented. When butter, jam, or sugar were scarce, molasses became the sweetener of choice for our grandparents' kitchens. Thick, dark, and inexpensive, it added flavor and calories to even the simplest meal, often paired with warm, humble biscuits. Biscuits made from flour and lard were split open and drizzled generously with molasses, creating a sweet, sticky treat that was cheap, filling, and satisfying. Sometimes a pinch of salt or a little leftover fat was added to enhance the flavor, but the molasses itself carried most of the taste. This combination wasn't just about sweetness, it was about making the most of what was available. Families could stretch a small amount of molasses over several biscuits, turning a few ingredients into a meal that fed the entire household. Children loved it, and adults appreciated its simplicity and practicality. Molasses and biscuits were especially common during hard times like the Depression or wartime rationing, when traditional spreads were too expensive or unavailable. The dish became a symbol of thrift, ingenuity, and the ability to create something satisfying from the bare essentials. When fresh meat was scarce or rationed, Spam became a pantry lifesaver for many households. Affordable, long-lasting, and easy to store, it paired perfectly with potatoes to create a hearty, filling meal that could stretch across a family. The preparation was simple. Slices of Spam fried until golden and slightly crisp, served alongside boiled, mashed, or fried potatoes. Sometimes onions or leftover vegetables were added if available, but even Spam and plain potatoes alone provided enough calories and flavor to satisfy hunger. During World War II and the years following, Spam was a staple in kitchens across the country, especially for families on tight budgets. It was quick to cook, could be eaten hot or cold, and required no fancy ingredients. A little went a long way, turning humble staples into a meal that felt substantial. For children, the salty, rich flavor made it a welcome treat. For parents, it was a practical solution to feeding a family without overspending.
Spam and potatoes symbolized adaptability,
showing how simple ingredients could be transformed into comfort and sustenance in hard times.
Oatmeal wasn't tea just for breakfast. Our grandparents often ate it for supper when cupboards were low and budgets were tight. Cheap, filling, and easy to prepare. It became a versatile meal that could stretch a small amount of ingredients to feed an entire family. The oatmeal was cooked slowly in water or milk, sometimes sweetened with a pinch of sugar, molasses, or a drizzle of syrup if available. For a savory twist, leftover fat, salt, or even bits of vegetables could be stirred in, transforming plain oats into a warm, comforting dish. Oatmeal for supper was practical. It required minimal effort, could be made in large batches, and was gentle on young and old stomachs alike. Children often ate it quietly at the table, while parents appreciated that it provided energy and fullness without costing much. In many households, oatmeal represented ingenuity and resilience, proof that a simple grain, cooked with care, could turn scarcity into nourishment. Today, it's often remembered as humble and unremarkable. But for those who grew up with it, it was a quiet hero of survival in the kitchen. When meat was scarce or too expensive, our grandparents didn't let that stop them from enjoying gravy, a meal's most comforting companion. They learned to make pan gravy from flour, water, and leftover fat instead of meat drippings, creating a simple, filling sauce to pour over bread, potatoes, or vegetables. The process was humble but effective. Fat or bacon grease was heated in a pan. Flour was stirred in to make a roux, and water or milk was added slowly until it thickened. Seasoning, salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of herbs made a plain mixture taste warm, savory, and surprisingly satisfying. Gravy without meat was practical, economical, and adaptable. It could stretch small portions of food into a meal, helping families survive lean weeks when protein was scarce. Children often loved it, poured over bread, turning a simple slice into a hearty bite. This dish exemplifies the resourcefulness and ingenuity of a generation that learned to make do with what was available. It may seem plain today, but back then, gravy without meat was more than a sauce. It was survival, comfort, and the ability to turn scarcity into sustenance.